Welcome to Module 1. Before we start diving into the code, I want to give some brief motivations for LangGraph and also give a roadmap for the overall course so you kind of have a sense for what to expect. So, first, a solitary language model alone is somewhat limited. It doesn't have access to tools, it doesn't have access to external context like documentation. It can't alone perform multi-step workflows. And so many LLM applications use some kind of control flow with steps before and after LLM calls. This could be tool calls, this could be retrieval steps, and so forth. And this control flow forms chain. Now, you've probably heard this term chain. You can think about this as some set of steps before and after an LLM call. Now, the nice thing about chains is they are very reliable. So the same flow of steps occurs every time you invoke the chain. But we do want LLM systems that can pick their own control flow for certain kinds of problems. Like you may want an LLM application that can choose its own set of steps depending on the problem it's faced. And this is really what an agent is. This is at least one simple definition of an agent. It's a control flow that's actually defined by an LLM. So you have chains, which are fixed control flows that are set by developer. You have agents, which are LLM-defined control flows. Now, the interesting point here is that there's actually many different kinds of agents. So you can think about dialing the amount of control you give to the LLM from low to high. On the lower end, you can think about things like routers. This is where an LLM controls a single step in a flow, and it may choose between a narrow set of options. In this toy example, I go from step 1 either to 2 or 3 based upon the LLM's decision. On the other extreme, you may have a fully autonomous agent that can pick any sequence of steps through some set of given options, or even it can generate its own steps that it can take. So it can kind of auto-generate its own next move based upon some potentially available resources. Now here's the catch. There are practical challenges. We can think about application reliability on the y-axis, and you can think about the level of control you give the LLM on the x. Now typically what we've seen, as you ramp up the level of control you give to the LLM, the reliability drops. So going from something really simple like a router to something much more complicated like a fully autonomous agent, the application does degrade in terms of reliability. So this is really kind of setting up the motivation for LangGraph. LangGraph is aimed to help you bend this reliability curve, allowing you to build agents that maintain reliability even as you push out the level of control you actually give to the LLM or agent. And this is kind of a simple kind of statement that summarizes to keep in the back of your head kind of why LangGraph and what are we trying to achieve with it. Now, some of the intuitions here. In many applications, we want to kind of combine developer intuition with LLM control. And so you can very easily specify certain steps in application that you always want to be fixed. So you start your flow, you go to step 1, you end with step 2 every time. But you also can interject LLMs at arbitrary points, turning it into an agent, giving the LLM kind of arbitrary control over the flow of the application. Now, these are expressed as graphs, and graphs are really nice. They contain nodes, which nodes you can think about as the steps in your application. It can be a tool call, it can be a retrieval step, and edges are just the connectivity between nodes. And there's a lot of flexibility as to how you lay out nodes and edges, and we'll get into this in a lot of detail throughout the course. So there's a few specific pillars for LangGraph that help you achieve this goal that we're talking about. So LangGraph has persistence, it has streaming, it has human in the loop, and has a lot of advanced controllability features. And these pillars are going to be kind of cornerstones of the modules in this course. And so we're going to be going to each of these in a lot of detail, and I'll give you a roadmap for that in just a minute. I do want to mention that LangGraph also comes with an IDE. So it's basically a visual environment that you can use to debug and visualize your agents that you build. We'll be using this quite a bit. You'll see it's a very useful debugging and kind of observability tool. And I do want to highlight that LangGraph plays very nicely and naturally with LangChain. So you can think about LangChain as another open source library, of course, and it has many different integrations in particular. So there's many different LLM integrations, vector store integrations, and so on. We often use these LangChain components within our LangGraph workflows. So let's take a simple example I show on the top, like basically a RAG or retrieval augmented generation toy application where we have a retrieval step from a vector store, and then we have an LLM step that takes the retrieved documents and answers a question. The retriever itself is a vector store, and that would be, for example, doesn't have to be, but it could use a LangChain vector store. Likewise, the LLM node can indeed use a LangChain integration for that LLM, but you actually don't have to. So you do not have to use LangChain with LangGraph, but we'll be using LangChain quite a bit for these integrations in the course, and you'll see it does provide some particularly nice features, especially in terms of LLM interoperability. So LangChain gives you a common interface, a common set of methods for invoking LLMs, which is really convenient because it lets you swap out the model very easily. But you don't have to use LangChain with LangGraph. I just want to highlight that the two do work very nicely together. And we'll be highlighting LangChain kind of incidentally throughout the course, but you do not have to use LangChain. So let's kind of lay out what we're going to do here. So module 1, we're going to lay the foundations. We're going to introduce LangGraph Studio. We're going to introduce kind of the core abstractions within LangGraph. And we'll actually build two interesting agent architectures. We'll build a router, and we'll build a generic tool calling agent. And you see these little diagrams from LangGraph Studio. So by end of module 1, you'll have built two different agent architectures. You'll have spun up Studio. You'll know the basics of how LangGraph works. And so we'll really be on our way, and we're going to be covering that next in the following lessons. Now, module 2 is going to move more into memory. So we're going to build up to a chatbot with memory that can sustain long-running conversations. And this will kind of show you how to use persistence and memory with LangGraph. Module 3 is going to move into human in the loop. So how do we interject human in the loop for things like approval or things like editing the state in our LangGraph agents? And we're going to augment our agent from module 1 with human in the loop before the tool call. This will also introduce streaming. And finally, module 4 is going to bring all these things together in an interesting and fairly complex research assistant that can be customized to your liking. It'll use human in the loop. It'll use parallelization features like MapReduce. And it'll use streaming. And it'll also use memory and persistence. So it'll kind of bring together all these different threads, and it'll be a fun, kind of interesting, complex agent that you could easily customize for your own uses. So I do want to highlight that modules 1 through 3 are kind of laying the groundwork. They're a little bit more foundational. They do exhibit various agent architectures, router and tool calling agent in 1, chatbot with memory in 2, and then generic tool calling agent with human in the loop in 3. But if you're a more advanced user, you can maybe move more quickly through these modules and kind of skip to module 4, where we kind of put them all together into a more complex overall agent. If you really want to make sure you understand the fundamentals, then you can spend a bit more time on 1 through 3. But hopefully this gives you kind of a roadmap of where we're going. It shows you some of the architecture we're going to be building. And now let's go ahead and dive into the code.